We spend countless hours fine-tuning our algorithms. We adjust hyperparameters, monitor memory leaks, and optimize for perfect computational efficiency. But at the end of that pipeline sits a processor that we rarely take the time to calibrate: the human mind. Baseline human reasoning creates the true bottleneck in modern technical workflows. Dr. Peter Fascione defines critical thinking as a purposeful, self-regulatory judgment. Notice the phrase self-regulatory. It implies that analytical thinking is not an automatic human trait. It requires conscious, disciplined intervention to correct our own mental processes. We need to map out the human cognitive pipeline. By tracing exactly where our decision-making breaks down, we can treat human error not as a personal failing, but as a systems engineering problem to be debugged. In data science, the unmonitored human evaluating the output stands as the single greatest point of failure. This diagram represents the rational decision-making model, the theoretical ideal taught in engineering schools, outlining exactly how we supposedly make choices. It assumes we possess perfect objectivity, absolute systematic evaluation, and infinite processing capability to test every hypothetical alternative before acting. Economist and cognitive psychologist Herbert Simon pointed out a severe flaw in this mathematically perfect ideal. He introduced the concept of bounded rationality, which describes the actual operating conditions for engineers, analysts, and anyone making real-world choices. In reality, our rationality is strictly bounded by three constraints: limited data, strict time deadlines, and the absolute biological limits on our cognitive processing. Under these pressures, the brain deploys a necessary workaround Simon called satisficing, a combination of satisfying and sufficing. Because of these constraints, we rarely execute true optimization. Instead, we scan our options and select the first one that meets our minimum acceptable criteria. We choose what is good enough, not what is perfect. Recognizing that we operate under bounded rationality is the first step to debugging our decisions. Our choices might be practically reasonable given the circumstances, but they are rarely perfectly rational. To conserve its limited quota of cognitive energy, the human brain automatically deploys mental shortcuts, known as heuristics. Psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated how these efficient mental shortcuts inevitably misfire, creating systematic errors we call cognitive biases. Consider confirmation bias. This visual shows the tendency to seek out information confirming existing beliefs, while actively rejecting contradictory evidence. An analyst might point out every instance their model succeeds, while unconsciously treating contradictory error rates as statistical noise. Then there's anchoring bias. This occurs when we rely too heavily on the very first piece of information we encounter in a dataset. If an early prototype shows high accuracy, that initial metric becomes an anchor. We continue to judge the entire project's viability based on that first impression, even as subsequent data degrades. The availability heuristic happens when recent, vivid, or emotionally resonant events are given disproportionate mathematical weight in our minds. If a server crashes spectacularly during a major presentation, we might conclude the entire architecture is completely unreliable, ignoring months of steady, continuous uptime. These biases represent inevitable systemic processing errors inherent to a bounded environment. To trace how data turns into flawed action, we use Chris Argyris's ladder of inference. Starting at the shared data pool, we select a tiny fraction of reality. Past experiences assign meaning, which quickly hardens into unchecked assumptions, like assuming late reports mean laziness. This assumption becomes a rigid internal belief, operating as a permanent filter. Finally, we arrive at the action stage. That rigid belief drops out of the funnel, dictating a flawed professional action, like giving a poor review or rejecting a valid model. Here is the danger. The individual believes they acted entirely objectively, based on the data. They remain completely blind to the fact that their internal pipeline warped the inputs long before conscious processing even began. If our automatic processing is inherently flawed, we need a method to bypass it. We need an engineered regulatory patch, which academia calls the information literacy process. The foundation of this patch is effective collation, the deliberate, systematic transformation of scattered, unstructured inputs into a coherent, actionable body of knowledge. Step 1 requires us to determine the exact nature and boundaries of the information we need before we even look at the data. Defining the problem early prevents cognitive overload. Step 2 is accessing information efficiently, strictly relying on verified domain experts and credible datasets. Step 3 is critical evaluation. We must actively check for bias, accuracy, and completeness before accepting any input as fact. The final standard is ethical usage. In rigorous professional environments, every single statement must be explicitly justified by either prior validated work or direct observable data analysis. Nothing is assumed. Applying this structured framework forces the brain out of its automatic satisficing mode. It deliberately slows us down, returning us to disciplined, objective analysis. We have two pathways available to us: the rapid, unmonitored funnel of our own biases yielding a suboptimal choice, or the deliberate, step-by-step structural grid yielding actionable insight. True analysis demands moving beyond surface-level acceptance. It requires breaking information down into its component parts to explore actual causal relationships rather than assumed ones. Take a moment to audit a recent major professional decision you made. Did you systematically evaluate the alternatives? Or did time constraints and bounded rationality force you into a biased shortcut? In data science, relying on an unchecked personal assumption is the exact equivalent of deploying a known bug directly into a production environment. As the author Christopher Hitchens observed, true intellectual independence is rooted entirely in the process of thinking rather than the specific content of one's thoughts. Critical thinking is never a passive state. It requires the relentless, hard work of auditing and managing your own cognitive architecture.